Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, bringing you the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In this episode, we start in the Americas, where the U.S. National Guard has been deployed in Washington. The Mexican government faces a new anti-cartel strategy from the White House, and Ecuador declares a state of emergency amid a surge in gang violence. In Europe, Middle East and Africa, we look at Ukraine and Europe's exclusion from US-Russia ceasefire talks, growing protests in Israel, security alerts in the United Arab Emirates, and unrest in Côte d'Ivoire. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover the impact of Typhoon Podul on Taiwan and China. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. First, we turn to the Americas, where in the United States, the White House has deployed the National Guard to Washington, D.C., sparking concerns over potential unrest. On the 11th of August, U.S. President Donald Trump announced the deployment of roughly 800 National Guard troops to Washington, D.C., along with the temporary federal takeover of the city's police department. This marks the second time the administration has sent federal forces into a city. The first instance was in June in Los Angeles, California. In Los Angeles, the deployment was justified as a reaction to local civil unrest. In contrast, the Washington operation has been described as an effort to curb crime in the nation's capital. Washington, D.C. experienced a sharp rise in crime following the COVID-19 pandemic. Murders peaked in 2023 at roughly 40 per 100,000 residents, the highest rate in 20 years, before declining in the years since. The administration has warned that other cities, such as Chicago, could have similar deployments in the future. And now, our assessment. Less than a week before the National Guard's deployment, a 19-year-old staffer from the newly established Department of Government Efficiency was attacked and injured during an attempted robbery in Washington. The incident drew significant media attention, largely because of the profile of the agency, likely serving as the immediate political justification for sending federal forces to the Capitol. More broadly, it's highly likely that this move reflects growing tensions between the Republican-held White House and Democrat-controlled municipal and state authorities. The earlier deployment of the National Guard to Los Angeles sparked a conflict between the White House and California Governor Gavin Newsom, who is sometimes described as a potential candidate for the Democratic presidential ticket in 2028. The deployment of the National Guard will likely drive anti-government protests in Washington, D.C. in the immediate term. Both large-scale demonstrations and smaller symbolic actions, potentially aimed at disrupting transport, are expected in the city. There is also a realistic possibility that this unrest will be fueled by other grievances against the current administration, including opposition to the deportation of undocumented migrants and to the ongoing war in Gaza. Staying in the Americas, where in Mexico, President Trump has reportedly authorized the use of lethal force against drug cartels. President Donald Trump has reportedly instructed the Pentagon to prepare for the use of lethal force against drug cartels and organized crime groups in Latin America. This follows his secret signing of a directive that provides a legal basis for potential military operations at sea and on foreign soil. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has also stated that the U.S. should begin treating such groups as armed terrorist organizations, rather than simply drug-dealing organizations. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has reaffirmed that U.S. military personnel will not be allowed to operate on Mexican territory. She said that while her government was informed of the order, it does not involve operations on Mexican soil. Sheinbaum has consistently rejected offers of external military assistance from President Trump and has repeatedly stated that any unilateral U.S. military action would be a serious violation of Mexico's sovereignty. Now, for our analysis, the reported directive follows the Trump administration's earlier decision to designate multiple cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. It also comes after months of both covert and overt U.S. intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations targeting the cartels. These operations have likely given the United States a much deeper understanding of cartel structures, high-value targets, smuggling routes, logistics hubs, and leadership networks. Combined with the legal authority provided by the FTO designation, this has almost certainly placed the U.S. in a much stronger position to carry out operations against the cartels. However, any unilateral military action would almost certainly violate Mexican sovereignty, trigger a severe diplomatic backlash, and undermine existing bilateral cooperation on counter-narcotic operations, migration, and security. The move is likely intended to appeal to the Trump administration's political base while applying maximum pressure on the Sheinbaum government to step up its own anti-cartel efforts. On the 13th of August, Mexico extradited another 26 high-profile suspected cartel members to the United States. This was the second major transfer of 2025 and likely indicates that the Sheinbaum administration is responding to increased U.S. pressure. While the immediate likelihood of unilateral U.S. military action remains low, it cannot be entirely ruled out given the expanded permissions, recent intelligence gathering, and political signaling involved. If such operations were to proceed without Mexican consent, they would almost certainly fuel strong anti-U.S. sentiment within the country and risk retaliation from the cartels. This could include direct attacks on U.S. personnel, facilities, and civilians, both inside Mexico and potentially within the U.S. itself. Still in the Americas, in Ecuador, where a state of emergency has been declared in 4 provinces following a surge in gang violence. On the 8th of August, President Daniel Noboa declared a 60-day state of emergency in the provinces of El Oro, Guayas, Los Rios, and Manabí. The law significantly expands the powers of the armed forces and the national police, allowing them to conduct joint operations aimed at reducing crime. The state of emergency follows an escalation in the conflict between the organized crime groups Los Choneros and Los Lobos, which began after the extradition of Los Choneros leader José Adolfo Macías, known as Fito, to the United States on the 20th of July. The most recent incident of violence was a shooting at a nightclub in Santa Lucia, which left 8 people dead and 3 injured. This follows similar attacks earlier in the summer, on the 27th of July, where 17 people were killed at La Clínica Bar in El Empalme, and on the 19th of July, where 9 people were killed in a pool hall in Playas. Now for our intelligence team's assessment. The extradition of Fito has almost certainly dismantled the leadership structure of Ecuador's largest gang. While he had been locked up in an Ecuadorian prison, Fito was still able to effectively run Los Choneros from his cell, something almost certainly prevented by his transfer to the United States. Los Lobos has almost certainly sought to expand its control in Manabí province, once a Los Choneros stronghold, by exploiting this leadership vacuum. This has led to a spike in fatalities in the region. Nearly 80% of the country's violence is reportedly concentrated in coastal provinces, which serve as key transit points for drug shipments. These provinces include 3 of the 4 where President Noboa has declared a state of emergency. President Daniel Noboa, re-elected in May 2025, has sought to emulate the tactics of El Salvador's President Bukele by cracking down on gangs. In January 2024, following Fito's prison escape, Noboa declared an internal armed conflict. The declaration suspended many civil liberties and allowed the military and police to operate with greater force, particularly inside prisons. While these measures initially suppressed violence, the increased pressure on gang leadership triggered internal disputes and fragmentation. This, in turn, caused violence to spike, reaching its highest rate in 2025. Although the government's actions will almost certainly result in more arrests, they are unlikely to halt the surge in violence. With the leadership of Los Choneros now contested, intensified security force activity is likely to further inflame internal conflicts and could lead to additional splits within the gang. Ecuador has become increasingly attractive to drug traffickers and money launderers due to its location between major cocaine producers Colombia and Peru, its strategic ports, and its dollarized economy. In recent years, gangs from other countries, particularly Mexico, Albania, and Italy, have expanded their presence in Ecuador, strengthening local criminal organizations that have absorbed local street gangs. While Los Choneros emerged as the country's largest gang, Los Lobos, which split from Los Choneros in 2020 following the assassination of leader Jorge Luis Zambrano, has grown into Ecuador's second-largest gang and its biggest rival. This rivalry is intensified by international cartel alliances. The Sinaloa cartel supports Los Choneros, while their rivals, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, back Los Lobos. These alliances provide local gangs with funds, weapons, and other resources, making them far more powerful and organized. This development is likely to undermine President Noboa's attempts to emulate El Salvador's success in combating gang violence. Now we move to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where Ukraine and Europe have been excluded from upcoming US-Russia talks, raising concerns over the direction of ceasefire negotiations. On the 15th of August, US President Trump is scheduled to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Anchorage, Alaska. This will be their first face-to-face meeting since 2019. The Trump administration has described the meeting as a listening exercise, but has also warned of very severe consequences if Russia refuses to agree to some form of negotiated ceasefire. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will not take part in the talks and has categorically rejected any deal brokered without Ukraine's participation. Unconfirmed reports suggest that President Putin is demanding Ukraine cede its fortress belt, a 50-kilometer defensive line that includes the key Donbas cities of Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Drushkivka, and Kostiantynivka, along with several smaller fortified towns. On the 13th of August, European leaders, including Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Poland, and the European Union, had a virtual meeting with Presidents Trump and Zelensky to reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty. They stressed that any ceasefire negotiation or future peace agreement must include Ukraine, safeguard its internationally recognized borders, and be backed by tangible security guarantees. On the 11th of August, Russian ground forces intensified their operations in eastern Ukraine by launching an offensive near Dobropilya in the Donetsk Oblast. Reports indicate that Russian forces captured several small villages in the area, advanced up to 10 kilometers beyond established defensive lines, and severed the main supply route linking Dobropilya to Kramatorsk. The offensive has placed additional pressure on Ukraine's undermanned forces in the region and has strengthened Russia's ability to encircle Pokrovsk, a vital defensive and logistical hub often referred to as the gateway to Donetsk. On the 11th of August, the Dobropilya offensive began in Donetsk Oblast, with Russian units capturing several villages to the east and southeast of the city. This advance severed the highway linking Dobropilya to Kramatorsk and increased pressure on Pokrovsk and the surrounding areas. Analysts assess that this military push was timed to strengthen Russia's position ahead of the Alaska meeting. Now for our analysis, the scheduling of high-level talks between Washington and Moscow without Ukrainian or European participation will almost certainly be seen as a win for Russia. The talks have effectively allowed President Putin to bypass the recent deadline set by President Trump, giving Russia additional time to consolidate its recent territorial gains on the battlefield and to strengthen its bargaining position ahead of any future substantive negotiations. Russia's recent advances are likely limited in technical scope, but strategically timed to coincide with high-level diplomatic engagements with the United States. These territorial gains have exploited Ukraine's shortage of manpower and have almost certainly increased pressure on the Zelensky administration ahead of any future negotiations involving Ukraine. Russia's demand that Ukraine cede the fortress belt will almost certainly be rejected. The area has been heavily fortified since 2014 and serves as Kyiv's primary layered defensive position in eastern Ukraine. Russian forces currently have no immediate means of encircling or breaking through this defensive line. Its loss would give Russia direct access to the remaining Ukrainian-held urban and logistical hubs in Donetsk Oblast, including Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Ukraine would then have limited time and resources to establish new fortified positions, placing Russia in a significantly stronger position if hostilities were to resume in the future. The failure to achieve any beneficial outcomes in Alaska will almost certainly lead Russia to intensify operations in Ukraine, both through continued ground offensives and sustained long-range strikes on Ukrainian population centers. Ukrainian intelligence reports early indications that Russia is preparing new major offensives, including in Sumy. These are likely intended to further exploit Ukraine's current limitations by overstretching its already strained resources and by taking advantage of any diplomatic deadlock. Russia is likely calculating that it can withstand any additional sanctions or punitive measures from the Trump administration in the short term. While costly both on the battlefield and economically, Russia's approach is now likely serving one of its primary strategic objectives, fracturing Western and NATO unity. The war in Ukraine is increasingly straining cohesion between the United States and Europe by exposing divisions over the scale of military aid, the terms of a settlement, and the prioritization of Ukraine over other strategic considerations, such as China. European leaders have even warned President Trump not to strike a unilateral peace deal with Russia, likely reflecting fears that such an agreement could set a dangerous precedent. That force can be successfully used to alter internationally recognized borders, undermining the rules-based international order that underpins European security. Putin is therefore likely to continue delaying substantive negotiations, both to pursue maximalist objectives in Ukraine and to advance Russia's broader strategic aims. Moving on to Israel, where several large-scale protests are planned in Tel Aviv over the government's Gaza strategy and the Haredi draft bill. Families of the Israeli hostages currently held by Hamas in the Gaza Strip have organized a large-scale protest on the 17th of August. The demonstration is in opposition to the Israeli government's plan to militarily occupy Gaza City, which would expand the area controlled by the Israel Defense Forces. Several universities, opposition parties, and local authorities have backed the protest, which will take the form of a general strike and street demonstrations. A large protest was already held in Tel Aviv on the 10th of August, with local media reporting an attendance of approximately 100,000 people. The Haredi group known as the Jerusalem Faction has also reportedly planned a large demonstration for an unspecified date next week, which will include an attempt to block access to Ben Gurion Airport. Haredi groups are protesting what they see as government inaction on the controversial Haredi draft bill, a dispute that has reportedly led to a series of arrests of ultra-Orthodox citizens who refuse to serve in the IDF. Another protest is scheduled for the 14th of August outside the Beit Lid military prison, where several of those arrested are being held. Now for our team's assessment. The two protest movements highlight growing dissatisfaction with the Israeli government's handling of the war. Families of the hostages strongly oppose the offensive on Gaza City, believing that it will significantly increase the risk of the captives being injured or killed, either by Hamas or during rescue operations. Prime Minister Netanyahu's administration has long framed the release of all hostages as the central objective of the war in Gaza. However, it is also facing mounting pressure from far-right coalition members who have called for the annexation of large parts of the Gaza Strip and their settlement by Israeli citizens. At the same time, the Netanyahu government is experiencing a major split with its ultra-Orthodox coalition allies. Last month, the two Haredi parties, United Torah Judaism and Shas, withdrew from the coalition, reducing it to a minority in parliament. While the Knesset is currently in recess, making a vote of no confidence highly unlikely in the immediate term, the departure of two parties has almost certainly weakened the government significantly. It's highly likely that the large-scale unrest planned for August 14th to 21st, and particularly between August 14th and 18th, will cause significant travel and service disruptions in Tel Aviv and possibly other major Israeli cities. Protesters are likely to block the Ayalon Highway, the city's main roadway, and may also attempt to block the routes leading to Ben Gurion Airport. Staying in the region, where several Western governments, including the United States and the United Kingdom, have issued security alerts for the United Arab Emirates, warning of potential attacks on locations associated with Israel or the Jewish community. On the 8th of August, the U.S. Embassy in the UAE reported receiving information indicating threats toward the Jewish and Israeli communities, advising its citizens to avoid such locations. The UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office issued a similar alert, warning that terrorists are very likely to try to carry out attacks in the UAE. The governments of Canada and Australia have also released similar alerts. And now our assessment. The security alerts issued by Western governments follow an advisory from Israel's National Security Council published on the 31st of July, warning Israeli citizens to avoid all non-essential travel to the UAE. The NSC stated that Iran and its proxy forces, including Lebanese Hezbollah, Hamas, and other militant groups, are planning attacks on Israeli and Jewish interests in the UAE in response to Israel's strikes in Iran and the ongoing war in Gaza. It also warned of an increased threat during Jewish holidays and on the Shabbat. The issuance of security alerts from several Western governments likely indicates that the warnings are based on verified but sensitive intelligence that cannot be made public. Additional alerts may follow from other countries, including those in the Gulf states. The UAE is likely viewed by extremist groups as a high-profile and legitimate target because of its growing Jewish community, its close diplomatic and economic ties with Israel under the Abraham Accords, and its status as a symbol of Western alignment and influence in the Middle East. The Jewish community in the UAE is estimated at between 1,000 and 3,000 people, and hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens visit the country each year. Iran is likely exploring non-attributable means of retaliation against Israel following recent attacks on its nuclear program and conventional military capabilities. A proxy-conducted attack on Israeli or Jewish targets in the UAE or in other third countries would allow Tehran to hit a high-visibility target while maintaining plausible deniability. Such an attack would also highly likely be seen as sub-threshold and would unlikely warrant a direct military retaliation from Israel. Iran has used this approach before, with both successful and attempted attacks recorded in Bulgaria, Argentina, Cyprus, Thailand, and India. If Iran or extremist groups not aligned with Iran were to pursue this course of action, the most likely form of attack would involve improvised explosive devices against locations with a strong Israeli or Jewish association. Likely targets could include the Israeli embassy in the UAE, synagogues, kosher restaurants, Jewish community centers, or businesses linked to Israeli nationals, most of which are concentrated in Dubai. Softer targets with lighter security could also be chosen, such as shopping malls, hotels, or event venues frequented by Israeli nationals or members of the Jewish community. Finally, we take a look at Côte d'Ivoire, where anti-government protests have erupted following the arrest of opposition figures. On the 9th of August, thousands of Ivorians gathered in the streets of Abidjan carrying banners that read, "Enough is enough." The demonstration took place mainly in the densely populated suburb of Yopougon and remained peaceful. The protests follow the 4th of August arrest of 6 members of one of Côte d'Ivoire's largest opposition parties, the African People's Party, Côte d'Ivoire, or PPACI. According to government statements, the arrests came after a bus was set on fire and police officers were assaulted in Yopougon. Interior Minister Vagondo Diomande presented a video in which a self-identified PPACI member confessed to involvement in the attack, claiming he acted on behalf of the party alongside 15 others. Opposition parties and civil society groups have condemned the detentions as unconstitutional and as a threat to political stability ahead of the election on the 25th of October. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Political tensions in Côte d'Ivoire have been steadily rising in recent months. On the 29th of July, 83-year-old President Alassane Ouattara announced that he would run for a fourth term in the upcoming October 25th election. Ouattara, who has been in power since 2011, claims that a constitutional amendment signed in 2016 reset his presidential term limit. This announcement significantly increases the likelihood of widespread civil unrest during the election period in a country that has not experienced a peaceful transfer of power since the death of President Félix Houphouët-Boigny in 1993. In 2010, a political crisis escalated into a civil war, which resulted in the deaths of at least 3,000 civilians. While opposition figures and citizens will almost certainly want to avoid a return to civil war, the perceived disregard for the Constitution greatly heightens the risk of instability surrounding the election. There is precedent for electoral violence in Côte d'Ivoire in recent years. In 2020, President Ouattara controversially chose to seek a third term following the sudden death of his designated successor, Prime Minister Amadou Gon Coulibaly. The decision drew strong condemnation from opposition parties and triggered large-scale protests, which were met with crackdowns by security forces, resulting in the deaths of at least 6 people. Opposition parties boycotted the election, and Ouattara was re-elected with 95.31% of the vote, amid very low turnout. Further widespread unrest is highly likely in the lead-up to and immediately after the election. Security forces are also highly likely to respond with force, consistent with previous periods of unrest in Côte d'Ivoire. Shifting to Asia-Pacific, Typhoon Podul has made landfall in Taiwan and China, causing disruptions and evacuations across the region. Typhoon Podul made landfall near Taimali in southeastern Taiwan's Taitung County, causing power outages for approximately 28,000 households in Taitung and affecting around 4.9 thousand households in Kaohsiung. The storm left 1 person missing and caused more than 100 injuries in Taiwan. In China, Typhoon Podul made landfall along the coast of Fujian province, bringing heavy rain and prompting emergency responses and evacuations. Over 18,000 people were evacuated in Guangdong as preparations were made for the storm's arrival. Airports across the region reported numerous flight cancellations, with more than a third of flights to Quanzhou cancelled. As of the 14th of August, Hong Kong has downgraded its rainstorm warning to the second highest level, although heavy rainfall is still expected to cause flooding and disrupt traffic. In Taiwan, Penghu County has resumed normal travel operations after being affected by the typhoon, with only minor damage reported. Taiwan has lifted its land and sea warnings as the storm moves away, though heavy rain is still forecast in certain areas. Earlier, Hong Kong had issued its highest-level black rainstorm warning multiple times in response to the storm. And now, our assessment. This is the third large storm to hit Taiwan in recent weeks, following Typhoon Danas and Tropical Storm Komei in July. Typhoon Podul is the strongest storm to affect Taiwan this year, with sustained wind speeds reaching 155 kilometers per hour, equivalent to a Category 2 typhoon or hurricane. Despite the intensity, Taiwan has developed a robust infrastructure to withstand typhoons. This includes seawalls and breakwaters, extensive urban drainage systems, building codes that require reinforced concrete and wind-resistant designs, advanced warning systems, tiered evacuation protocols and pre-positioned utility crews. These measures help minimize disruption and rapid recovery once they have passed through. Podul passed well south of Taipei, sparing the capital. While major metropolitan areas were largely unaffected, the typhoon has likely caused crop damage, which could negatively affect Taiwan's economy. Lingering disruptions are highly likely as Taiwan, Hong Kong, and coastal areas of China recover from the storm's passage. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.